The sun was high in the sky, blazing down over the wide open prairie. Dust swirled lazily in the wind, and the faint sound of cattle lowing in the distance carried across the dry golden grass. Jake Harper sat tall in the saddle, scanning the horizon with eyes sharpened from years of life on the frontier. He was a man of few words, known in the small town nearby as a reliable cowboy who could handle both cattle and horses better than almost anyone else. His companion, a jet-black horse with a streak of white down his forehead, named Shadow, walked steadily beside him, ears twitching as though listening to secrets only he could hear. Jake trusted Shadow more than he trusted most people. The horse had a quiet intelligence, a kind of sixth sense that often guided Jake safely through dangers he didn't even know existed. Today, the two were on a routine cattle drive, moving a herd from one grazing area to another. It was nothing out of the ordinary, just another long day under the hot sun. But sometimes even the most ordinary days held surprises that could change everything. As the morning passed, Shadow began acting strangely. The horse's ears swiveled back and forth, and he started picking up his pace, dragging Jake along the edge of the prairie. Jake felt a flicker of unease. Shadow had never been this restless without reason. "Easy there, boy," Jake said, trying to steady the horse. But Shadow refused to slow down. His hooves pounded the dry earth harder and harder, as if he could smell something in the distance that Jake could not. Sweat rolled down Jake's forehead, and he tightened his grip on the reins. Then, just over a rise in the terrain, Shadow stopped abruptly, stamping the ground and letting out a loud neigh. Jake leaned forward, squinting against the bright sunlight. That's when he saw her. Lying in the tall grass, almost hidden by the golden stalks, was a woman. She was small, barely moving, and her clothes were torn and stained. An arrow had pierced her shoulder, and her breathing was shallow and uneven. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had heard stories of skirmishes and attacks between settlers and native tribes, but he had never expected to find someone hurt like this, alone in the middle of nowhere. For a moment, he froze. He didn't know whether to approach her or stay back. He remembered the warnings from other townsfolk. Some people were quick to judge, and the tensions between the settlers and the Apache were real and dangerous. But Shadow wasn't afraid. The horse lowered his head and nickered softly, urging Jake to come closer. "All right, boy," Jake murmured, patting Shadow's neck. "Let's see if we can help her." Carefully, he slid down from the saddle, keeping his movement slow so as not to scare her. The woman stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. Dark, wary eyes met his, filled with pain but also with a spark of something untamed, something that spoke of courage and resilience. She tried to speak, but her voice was weak, broken. Jake couldn't understand the words, but he could feel the urgency behind them. He glanced at Shadow, who seemed almost protective, standing close to the woman as if guarding her. Jake knew he had to act quickly. He gently lifted her into his arms, careful not to hurt her further. It was heavy work, but he managed to get her onto Shadow's back, supporting her as best he could. The horse remained calm, almost understanding the gravity of the situation, and began walking steadily toward the nearest cabin that Jake knew was not far from the edge of the prairie. The journey was slow and tense. Every rustle in the grass, every distant caw of a crow made Jake's pulse quicken. He had to focus on keeping the woman steady and on keeping Shadow calm. When they finally reached the cabin, Jake gently laid her down on a bed of blankets he had prepared inside. The woman's breathing was shallow, and he could see the blood that had dried around the arrow wound on her shoulder. Jake tore a strip of cloth from his own shirt and carefully cleaned the wound as best he could, applying a simple bandage. He didn't have proper medical tools, but he knew how to tend to injuries enough to prevent infection. He worked in silence, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? How had she ended up out here alone? Was she in danger from more than just her wound? The woman's eyes followed every movement he made. Slowly, she tried to sit up, but Jake gently pressed her back down. "Easy now," he said softly. "You need to rest." She murmured something he couldn't understand, but the tone was not angry. It was almost like a warning, a plea to be careful. Jake nodded, understanding that she was trying to communicate something important, even if he couldn't comprehend the words. As the day turned to evening, the sunlight outside faded into a soft orange glow, filling the small cabin with a warm, peaceful light. Jake kept watch over her, checking the bandage and making sure she was comfortable. Shadow stayed close by the door, ears alert to every sound outside. The bond between the man and his horse was stronger than ever in this moment. and even the woman seemed to sense the loyalty and courage that radiated from both. When night fell, Jake sat by the fire exhausted but unable to sleep. The woman finally drifted into a light, restless sleep. Her breathing became steadier, though Jake could still see the occasional wince of pain. He felt a strange connection to her, a sense that their meeting had not been by chance. Shadow nuzzled her gently as if to reassure her, and Jake smiled faintly. The horse had always been more than just a companion. He was a guide, a protector, and today, perhaps, a hero. Jake thought about the world outside the cabin, the prairie stretching endlessly, the townsfolk who might not understand why he was helping someone from a group they feared, and the dangers that could come their way. But none of that mattered right now. All that mattered was keeping her alive and safe, and learning to trust each other in a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving. Hours passed slowly, and the fire crackled softly in the quiet cabin. Jake drifted into a light doze, but Shadow remained alert, standing by the bed. When the woman stirred again in the middle of the night, her eyes met Jake's, and for the first time he noticed a flicker of recognition. She tried to speak again, and although he couldn't understand the words, the meaning was clear. She needed him, and perhaps in some way, he needed her too. The prairie outside was silent except for the wind. The moon cast a gentle glow across the cabin, illuminating the scene of a man, a horse, and a wounded woman brought together by fate. For Jake, the day had started like any other, but now everything had changed. The discovery of the woman had set in motion events that would challenge his courage, test his heart, and ultimately reshape his life in ways he could never have imagined. He looked at Shadow, who flicked his ears back, almost as if acknowledging the unspoken truth between them. Together they had found her, and together they would protect her. There was danger ahead, yes, but there was also hope, and Jake Harper, the cowboy who had always walked his path alone, felt the stirrings of a connection that might lead him to something he had never expected. A new chapter in his life, written with trust, courage, and perhaps even the possibility of love. As the night deepened, the prairie lay quiet, hiding secrets in its shadows. But inside the small cabin, life had taken a dramatic turn. A man, a horse, and a wounded Apache woman had come together by chance, and the story that was beginning here promised to be one of bravery, trust, and the unlikely bonds that could form even in the most unforgiving landscapes. And as Jake sat by the fire, watching over her, he knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow would bring challenges, but they would face them together, guided by Shadow, and bound by a fate none of them could have predicted. Morning came slowly to the prairie. The first light of dawn painted the sky in soft shades of pink and orange, spilling through the small windows of Jake's cabin. Shadow, the black horse with the white streak, pawed the ground lightly outside, eager for the day but also alert to every sound. Jake stirred on a makeshift chair by the fire, careful not to wake the woman. Her name, he had learned slowly over the night, was Ahyoka, though he still struggled with the pronunciation. Her dark eyes held a quiet strength that impressed him. She had survived on her own in the wilderness, and now she was slowly learning to trust a man she barely knew. Jake checked her wounds again. The arrow had been removed, and the bandages had been changed, but the shoulder was still tender. Ahyoka winced slightly as he adjusted the cloth, but she did not complain. There was pride in her silence, a dignity that told Jake she was stronger than most people he had ever met. "Easy there," he whispered, glancing at Shadow. The horse nickered softly, stepping closer to nuzzle Ahyoka's shoulder, almost as if to say, "It's all right. You're safe now." Days turned into weeks. Jake and Ahyoka slowly learned to communicate. At first, it was a mix of gestures, broken words, and patient repetition. Jake taught her simple English words, while she showed him ways to move quietly through the prairie, how to find fresh water, and even small herbal remedies she used to ease pain. Shadow seemed to understand them both perfectly, always watching, always alert. Life at the cabin began to change. Jake's solitude, once a comfort, was now filled with conversation, laughter, and moments of shared silence that were warm rather than lonely. Ahyoka's presence brought a new energy. Even the small town nearby began to notice a difference. A few trusted townsfolk came by occasionally, bringing supplies and food, slowly accepting her because Jake had earned their respect over the years. Despite the peaceful days, danger was never far away. Jake knew that the men who had attacked Ahyoka were still out there. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky red and gold, Shadow suddenly tensed, ears pricked forward. He neighed sharply, pawing the ground. Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. Shadow was never wrong. "They're here," he said quietly to Ahyoka. She understood instantly, her eyes narrowing as she reached for the small knife she carried. They had prepared for this moment, but the tension was still thick. When the men arrived, they thought they would find an easy target. They were armed and confident, but they had not counted on Shadow or on Jake's knowledge of the land. Jake met them at the edge of the cabin, calmly holding a rifle, while Ahyoka stayed just behind him, ready to act if needed. Shadow stood close by, muscles coiled like a spring, ready to protect both of them. The standoff was tense. Words were exchanged, threats made, but Jake and Ahyoka stood firm. Then, with a sudden movement, the attackers tried to rush the cabin. Shadow reacted instantly, rearing and kicking, causing the attackers to stumble. Jake fired a warning shot into the air, and Ahyoka, using her agility, managed to disarm one of the men before he could react. The attackers, realizing they had underestimated the pair, finally retreated, disappearing into the shadows of the prairie. After the danger passed, Jake and Ahyoka stood together, catching their breath. Shadow nickered softly, lowering his head as if to calm the tension. Jake looked at Ahyoka and saw a mixture of relief and pride in her eyes. They had faced a threat, together, and survived. Not just because of their courage, but because of the trust they had built. Life slowly returned to normal. Ahyoka recovered fully, and the cabin became a home for the three of them. They worked side by side, tending to the land, caring for the animals, and learning from each other every day. Jake admired Ahyoka's resilience, her ability to adapt, and her deep respect for nature. She, in turn, grew to trust him completely, seeing in him a kindness and strength that went beyond his rugged exterior. Shadow remained at the center of their lives, a constant companion and protector. People in town would sometimes stop to marvel at the horse, whispering about how he had sensed danger and guided Jake to Ahyoka in the first place. In many ways, Shadow had become a hero, though he never seemed to understand the attention. For him, it was simply instinct, loyalty, and care for those he loved. As the seasons changed, so did the bond between Jake and Ahyoka. It was not sudden or dramatic, but subtle, built on shared experiences and quiet moments. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, talking softly about the past and the world beyond the prairie. They learned each other's habits, quirks, and preferences. Jake noticed the way Ahyoka's eyes would soften when she smiled. And Ahyoka found comfort in Jake's steady presence, knowing he would always protect her. One afternoon, as the sun hung high and the prairie stretched endlessly, Jake and Ahyoka rode together, Shadow leading the way. They came to a hill overlooking a small stream, where they paused to rest. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers, and the water sparkled in the sunlight. It was a peaceful moment, one of many they shared, but it felt significant, a symbol of survival, trust, and the life they were building together. Jake reached out and gently took Ahyoka's hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand in return. Neither of them spoke, but in that silence they understood each other completely. Their bond was no longer just about survival. It was about connection, respect, and the quiet beginnings of love. Shadow nuzzled both of them, as if sensing the moment. The horse had been there at the start, guiding them together, and now he stood witness to the life they were beginning to share. In a way, the journey had started long before Jake and Ahyoka met. Shadow had seen it coming, and he had made sure it happened. As the day ended, they rode back to the cabin, the sky painted with the soft colors of sunset. The prairie, once vast and lonely, now felt full of possibility. Jake thought about the days ahead, the challenges they might face, and the joy of sharing life with someone who had once been a stranger, but had become family. Ahyoka, riding close to him, felt the same, grateful for the safety, the trust, and the connection they had forged through hardship and courage. Life on the prairie was not always easy. There would be storms, both in weather and in life, but Jake and Ahyoka knew they could face them together. Shadow would always be there, loyal and protective, reminding them of how their story had begun: a wounded woman found in the grass, a horse who sensed danger, and a man brave enough to act. And so, the three of them continued their journey, riding across the open land, building a life rooted in trust, respect, and love. The prairie was no longer just a place to survive. It had become a place to live fully, with each day offering new lessons, challenges, and joys. The story of Jake, Ahyoka, and Shadow became known in the small town nearby. People spoke of the cowboy who had saved a wounded Apache woman and the horse who had guided him. But for Jake and Ahyoka, the story was not about fame or recognition. It was about survival, trust, and the bond they shared. A bond that had begun with courage, strengthened through trials, and blossomed into something enduring and beautiful. As the sun set over the prairie, casting long shadows across the golden grass, Jake looked at Ahyoka and smiled. She returned the smile, her eyes full of warmth and understanding. Shadow stood beside them, his ears flicking as he watched the horizon. Together they faced the world, knowing that whatever came next, they would not face it alone. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, full of promise and possibility, and in the quiet beauty of that vast land, a man, a woman, and a horse had found each other, forever changed by the courage, trust, and love that had brought them together.